top 50 plus minoritarians of all time. Started with number 1, the Mizraim of Baghdad. Now, you may know of the Ashkenazim of Europe, who, because of the various laws concerning usury, pushed or cajoled into a certain direction of economic life. Interestingly enough, in Baghdad, which was not Christian, it was Muslim, you had the Sassoon family in the 19th century, which was one of the richest families in the world at that time, and happened to be a Mizraim family from Baghdad. Number 2, the Alawites of Syria. Syria has been all over the news since, 2011 is when the civil war started. And you have to look at the family of Bashar al-Assad to notice there's something a little bit different going on here. Yes, the Alawite people of Syria are technically Muslims, much like the Mazdakites we'll talk about later, which are put forward as Islamic, but actually have a lot of pre-Islamic roots. They're said to believe in reincarnation. They practice endogamy, meaning that they marry within their group, so they're a distinct ethno-religious group, and they've been uniquely successful in Syria. Number 3, we're going to go to the Assyrians. The Assyrians, often referred to as Syrian Christians, these are people who consider themselves to be natives or autochthonous of the region. They have survived for a very long time. As Christians in the Middle East, they have played a big role historically. 25% of the Middle East used to be Christian prior to the fall of the Ottoman Empire. And the role of Assyrians in political life in the Middle East has also been pretty large, which is bringing us to quasi number 4, the Ba'athist Party. The Ba'athist Party is not an ethno-religious group per se. It's a political group or a political movement, which is centered on secular Arab nationalism. But what a lot of people don't know about Ba'athism is that while today it is secular in nature, at least prior to the fall of Saddam Hussein, it was a political entity which was secular in nature compared to the Muslim Brotherhood or other Islamic political organizations. But it started as mostly a Christian group. We can talk about the Coptic Christians. The Coptic Christians in Egypt could be number 5 on our list, who's keeping count. But the Coptic Christians are Christians who have lived in Egypt. They're about 10% of the population in Egypt. Like the other groups, the Assyrian Christians, the Alawites, and so on and so forth, they have embraced certain you might say Ba'athist tendencies. That is the tendency towards secularism in politics, in the political realm, the tendency toward military dictatorship rather than the alternative, which is typically theocracy. So they have their own history of persecution within Egypt, their own unique identity as an ethno-religious group, and they persist to this day. Number 6, I did want to mention the Donmeh. The Donmeh are a group of crypto Jews who have lived in the Middle East for some time. At times when Judaism was alternatively allowed a degree of autonomy, but also to a degree persecuted and to a degree discriminated against, some Jews saw it as in their benefit to maintain their esoteric identity, but to publicly identify as Muslims. Very similar to what we discussed with the Alawites. Even people like Justice Louis Brandeis in America was the descendant of the Sabbatean who are connected with the Donmeh. So, complicated network of identity here, but it's not just the Alawites who are said to be practicing crypsis in the Islamic world. Then you have the Mamluks. The Mamluks, these people were originally slaves, much like the Janissaries we'll talk about later. The Mamluks were people who were taken mostly from the Caucasus. The Circassians, the Ossetians, the Georgians, the people of the Caucasus Mountains. For whatever reason, these people were seen as good slaves or good warriors, and they were brought into other parts of the Middle East like Egypt. They later organized themselves as ethnic groups to gain dominance over these regions. So originally slaves, and actually they established dynasties that lasted up until the 18th and even 19th century. Speaking of Baghdad, Baghdad up until the 19th century was ruled by one of these Mamluk sultans. Finally, I want to name drop just a plethora of ethnic groups here. The Armenians, the Albanians. There are just a mixing of different groups that became prominent in what were known as the Barbary Pirates. The Barbary Pirates were not themselves an ethnic or religious group. It actually contained all different kinds of religions and ethnicities. But what's interesting about the Barbary Pirates is they had a lot of predominant non-Arab ethnicities within their ranks and within their leadership. So when you look at the most famous Barbary pirates, Barbarossa, Redbeard, and all kinds of Middle Eastern names I can't necessarily pronounce, but when you look into the most famous Barbary pirates, who they were, you find a number of Albanians, you find Armenians, Azerbaijanis, you find these ethnic groups that were small, that were minorities, that you wouldn't necessarily expect to have this kind of influence, and yet they were running piratical operations, a slave trade that kidnapped, captured, and sold into slavery over 1 million Europeans. This was an incredible operation. Now, a way people like to present this thing is as some kind of victimary, oh, look, Europeans were enslaved too. Sometimes this is the context in which you'll hear about this Mediterranean slave trade, but what they don't often tell you, what they like to hide a lot about the Ottomans and about the Barbary pirates, is that the leaders of these piratical crews, while they were multicultural, were like Armenians and Albanians. These were guys from Europe themselves who were participating in this European slave trade, similar to how the Vikings participated in that not too long before. So now we're going to hop over to Asia. We're going to talk about the overseas Chinese. Overseas Chinese are Chinese people who live outside of China. So this could be overseas Chinese in Vancouver. This could be overseas Chinese in the Philippines. President Duterte of the Philippines is actually half Chinese. When you look at places like Malaysia, Singapore, when you look at the economic impact, when you look at the we would refer to in the West as affirmative action, where there are certain quotas that Chinese cannot hold too many positions within Malaysian companies. So overseas Chinese form, in the West, they form Chinatowns. They've formed their exclusive zones. They tend to live in the cities rather than the rural countryside. And because of the nature of power and economics, that's the better place to be if you're concentrated in the cities to have an outsized influence. Sometimes the overseas Chinese are cited as a middleman minority, and they are influential, not just as pure Chinese, but they will intermarry into native ethnic groups like the Filipinos. For number 2 within Asia, we've got the Hakka people I've talked about before. A lot of people dispute the existence of the Hakka people as a distinct ethnicity. I would compare the Hakka to something like the American Southerner. The American Southerner is an American, right? So we could say that there's an amorphous American ethnicity, and then the American Southerner is a subset of that. Or if that's a little bit too confusing for you, we could say that we have people from England and then we have Northern English. They're not Scottish, they're not a different country from England, but they're Northern English. They have a distinct accent, distinct voting patterns. They are a distinct group, whether you want to call them an ethnicity or not. The Hakka people have had an outsized influence, especially in the 19th century with the War of the Heavenly Kingdom. You look at the generals involved, the people involved in that revolution, that Christian cult that started, that killed millions and tens of millions of people in China. We never hear about it, but that was predominantly Hakka instigated, as well as many other Chinese minorities we don't hear about. Again, the Hakka do speak a Han dialect, a dialect of Han Chinese, and so they're not thought of as separate from the main Han ethnicity of China, and we think of China as a mono-ethnic majoritarian society. But that's not the case, as we'll see with number 3, the Manchu. The Manchu dynasty, you may have heard of, are of a people who we have drawn a stereotype of eating dogs from. The fact is that the majority of Chinese people, dogs are not necessarily on the cuisine, but they're definitely on the cuisine for the Manchu people. The Manchu people are unlike the Han Chinese in their history. The Han Chinese centered on the Yellow River Valley. It's an ancient agricultural culture centered on these rice paddy farms and bureaucracy and test taking. And that is a distinct culture from the Manchu. The Manchu, a small minority within the Chinese Empire, but they took control as this more migratory hunter-gatherer style warriors similar to the Mongols. Now, talking of the Mongols, of course, were a small confederation that started around the 11th, 12th centuries of these warring little tribes living on the steppe with their horses and their archers. When Genghis Khan came along and he united them all, this small nation of people managed to conquer China, and they even tried to get into India, which we'll talk about, and they tried to go into Europe, and they went into Baghdad, as we've mentioned before. So the Mongols and the Manchu are very similar in that they are these you might call sub-Siberian peoples, the people who live below the Siberian plain or adjacent to it, who are horse people who throughout their history conquered and ruled over these quote-unquote civilized agrarian populations. There is another group we can talk about in conjunction, the Mughals. The Mughal dynasty in India conquered the native Indians who spoke an Indo-European language, and prior to that a Dravidian language, but the Mughals actually had a Turkic-Mongolic language. And so the Mughal dynasty and that influence was in conjunction with this Mongol expansion, cousin to the Manchus. So all of these people, sometimes they're referred to as the Tungustic peoples, these peoples or the Altaic language family sometimes, these peoples of Central Asia who form confederations at certain times and take over other cultures. Remember, India, just like China, was a huge population center in the ancient world, so this was no easy feat. One more thing about the Mongols I wanted to mention. Even today, we think that the time of Mongolia's glory is over, but the Mongols are still overrepresented today. When you look at Japanese sumo wrestling, and the best Japanese sumo wrestlers of all time are not Japanese at all. They're Mongolian. And in fact, there are even European sumo wrestlers who dominate in Japanese sumo wrestling, Georgian sumo wrestlers, people from the country of Georgia. So this is an interesting little tidbit, the fact that the Mongolians, even though they don't rule over China today, they're still dominating the sport of sumo wrestling as a legacy of their heritage of physical strength, prowess, and dominance over the Asian continent. We should also mention the Russians, who, if you look at their origins, actually come from what we today call the country of Belarus or Ukraine. That is their Urheimat, that is the place that they come from. They were dominated for many centuries by the Mongols under the Mongol yoke, but as soon as that broke, they had a rapid expansion toward the east. Prior to 1500, there were really no Russians living much farther east than the Volga River. In a few short centuries, very similar and in fact parallel to the westward expansion in America, these ethnic Russians expanded into Central Asia, into Kazakhstan, and into Siberia as far as Vladivostok, which is right next to North Korea. So this expansion happened in a few short centuries, and it was a small ethnic Russian population that managed to basically reverse the expansion of the Mongols, push them back, and push all the way into East Asia as a small group expanding across the plain, conquering everybody in their path, not necessarily killing all of them, because we still have many of those Asiatic ethnicities living in the areas today. Moving on then to the Germans. The Germans have at times pursued various minoritarian strategies. When we look at the interaction between the Romans and the Germans in the time of Julius Caesar, the Germans were entering into the Roman Empire, learning how to be warriors and soldiers, then going back and teaching their compatriots those technologies of war. We often imagine ancient Germans as running around with horned helmets and loincloths or whatever else, but the truth is that the Germans, like the Japanese in the 19th century, Germans were very willing to adopt Roman technology, so much so that they adopted ultimately what became the Roman religion of Christianity. So the Romans and the Germans had a syncretic relationship wherein the Germans were going into the Roman military, rising through the ranks, and becoming the best. They weren't the only ones to do this, by the way. The Gauls also practiced this, and under Julius Caesar, many Gallic allies were brought into the Senate. But the Germans pursued this strategy for long enough that they actually basically took over the military, that the vast majority of the military, or a significant portion, was German, and both at the low level and the high level. And so ultimately, when this German so-called invaded the German invasion of the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths and the Vandals, when they came in, they found many allies within the Roman Empire. And so it wasn't so much an outward invasion, but also an inward invasion that was then solidified and consolidated by the two groups, the Germans within Rome as well as the Germans from outside of Rome, coming together and uniting. This takeover of the Roman Empire by the Germans was not, again, as it's always portrayed in history, black and white, that they just came and smashed everything and they were barbarians and it was the age of darkness. The Germans actually really tried to continue Roman law, and they considered themselves to be Roman kings in the Roman tradition. One of these groups of Germans was the Franks, and the Franks were unique among the Germans because most of the Germans at that time practiced a version of Christianity derived from a man called Arius. That was the belief of the majority of Germans for whatever reason, as opposed to the Trinitarians of Rome, who believed, as we think of commonly today, the Trinitarian model. Franks were one of the few Germans who believed in the Trinitarian model, and they were also extremely successful in warfare. And so the combination of these two things meant that they had the favor of Rome, which came to be the seat of Christendom, at least in the West, and they also had all these military victories over non-Christian pagan Germans such as the Saxons. So the Franks came to dominate Europe. Charlemagne, we know, was crowned emperor by the Pope, and they founded not just the dynasty of France, after which, is named after the Franks, or Germany, and also, but Italy, right? And also in Spain, and also in Bulgaria, and all sorts of places, because the Franks and Charlemagne would intermarry with all these royal families, and almost every royal family can trace themselves back to the Franks. Speaking of the Spanish aristocracy, Google for me the top Spanish last names. You're going to find things like Rodriguez and Hernandez and Fernandez, Fernando. All of these names are Germanic in origin. So Rodriguez means son of Rodrig, and Fernandez means son of Ferdinand, Hernandez, son of Hernand, or Herman. So the reason for this is because the Spanish aristocracy was Germanic at this time. Remember that prior to the fall of the Roman Empire, the people of Spain, the Iberians, previously spoke a non-Latin language. Then the Romans came in, taught them all Latin. And then after the Roman Empire fell, the Germans came in and they ruled over them as Germans. In fact, the Germans made it as far as North Africa and established a kingdom there, a kingdom of the Vandals. German princes and kings married into Spanish aristocracy, gave them their last names, had a bunch of kids. We know that as the aristocracy has a bunch of kids, they distribute that last name throughout the population. And then the Moors come in and the Moors take over. But these Germanic princes who have assimilated into Spanish society, and now they speak Spanish, they are the blue bloods, right? And they exist at the top of the Iberian Peninsula in the mountainous regions. And then, of course, with the Reconquista, they reconquer Spain. So this is part of the reason, a legacy. You know, I'm not saying that every Spanish aristocrat is 100% German, but it's an interesting example of how a minority of Germans could come in and could leave a lasting impact on the etymology and the nomenclature of Spanish surnames. Going over to Russia now, we have the Varangians, who were Vikings from Scandinavia, who were big into sailing on these big rivers. They would take their river boats, and they were masters of travel, and they engaged in a lot of trade. As we mentioned before, they were big into the slave trade, not something that people like to think about with the Vikings buying and selling slaves, but that is something that they profited off of. And they traveled from Scandinavia through Russia, down through the Volga, and they made their way even to Byzantium, where they served as a kind of special ops or a special guard. They were mercenaries, and so they were involved in a lot of trade from Northern Europe through Eastern Europe, even through the Middle East. And they founded a lot of the kingdoms, early kingdoms of Russia, Rurik. And it's thought that Rus and the Rus people and Russian, that name ultimately comes from these Varangians. Coming up to a bit more modern times, you look at Russia, and there was a Soviet republic called the Volga-Deutsch Soviet Republic, which were these Volga Germans who were invited in several centuries earlier by Catherine the Great to be farmers. They emigrated in such numbers to this specific area that they had their own republic. You also had the Transylvania Saxons in Romania, who we think of the region that's sort of encapsulated by the Carpathian Mountains, and they are in that basin, that Carpathian basin, alongside the Hungarians as Protestants in Romania, which is a predominantly Orthodox country, with the Hungarians being predominantly Catholic. When we look at Peronists and their influence from the Prussian military, but there's an interesting German diaspora that we could connect later on with the Amish and the Mennonites. Zooming out a little bit to Europe as a whole, we can go back to the OG Minoritarians, although there might have been earlier still. The Indo-Europeans. The Indo-Europeans started in a very similar region to the Slavs in Ukraine, in the steppes north of the Caucasus, and they spread out and they went all the way to Ireland, and they went all the way to India. And they're mentioned in the Bible as the Hittites. And they had a huge influence in the fact that most people speak some kind of Indo-European language. Either you speak Spanish as a first or second language, English as a first or second language, Portuguese, French, German, Russian, Italian, Greek, right? The Latin alphabet, which almost everyone in the world can read, almost all literate peoples. It's certainly taught in China and all over the world. So these Indo-European language, Indo-European cultures was originally a small group of people who were not agriculturalists. Remember, this is about 6,000 years ago before these people expanded. They did not have huge cities. They were not practicing. They did not live in the Nile River Valley where the agriculture was off the walls. They didn't live in the Fertile Crescent where you just had so much fertile productivity that the population was exploding. These were a relatively sparsely populated groups of people who, like the Mongols, like the Manchu, like the Mughals, these were steppe peoples. They lived on horses. They are said to have invented the chariot, which is a pretty useful military technology, and then spread that out from there into the Middle East, where they did much conquering and intermixing with people. Then branched out, and we see how they had their own little minoritarian split-offs. That's always something to keep in the back of our minds. But we can look at some of the specifics throughout history in Europe. Other than the Germanic minoritarians, we also have the Italian nobility of the papacy. When you look at the papacy prior to the 20th century, prior to the Polish Pope and the German Pope they brought in and the Argentinian one they have now, but for the vast majority of papal history, these popes came from Italian nobility. So this group in the papacy of the Italian nobility, what's interesting is the way that these few different families and clans and tribes of Italian nobles, dating back to the Romans, by the way, kept inserting their sons into the papacy. And this went on for hundreds of years. But the fact that the papacy was an international institution with, you had France and you had Germany and you had Poland, you had all these countries, they never got to have a pope. It was always Italians from these noble families. And in fact, the Germans tried to put in what we today consider anti-popes. That is, during the investiture contest, the Germans tried, they said, we want a German pope, because they were having a doctrinal dispute. And so actually the German emperor declared one of his bishops to be pope, and there was a contest, and it could have gone the other way, but throughout history for thousands of years, the Pope has been Italian, not only Italian, but of these noble families, which is interesting to think about how these small Roman families, even after the collapse of Rome, were able to maintain power and influence through the papacy. Going back a little bit earlier to the Latin people themselves, we often think of Latin and Italian as synonymous. But if you go back into Roman history, you'll find that the Latin people were a small group centered on Rome. And to their north, in fact, were not just Italian people or Romance-speaking people. We can't even use that. Italic-speaking people at this time, because Romance derives from Roman. But these people living to the north, we had the Etruscans, who spoke a non-Indo-European language, much like the Basque. And then you also had the Celts and parts of Gaul, the provinces that they referred to as Gallic provinces in what today would be northern Italy. And then to the south, you had the Soci, and the Soci were groups of people who were non-Latin in origin. You had the Sicilians, you had the Greek colonists who lived in Italy at the time. So Italy itself was quite multicultural. You had Celtic peoples, you had Greek peoples, you had non-Indo-European speaking peoples. So it was a very diverse little subcontinent, you might say, of Europe, the Italian peninsula. And somehow, some way, the Latin people, through their own genius, managed to take over the entire peninsula and then create a world empire. So that is something to think about. We often think of the Romans as stretching from the Alps to Sicily, but that was not the case. That is a cultural development that the Romans themselves, through force of arms and diplomacy, created over time. This one I didn't know to put in the European category, but the Khazar conversion, which is talked about often in salacious terms, but let's look at it very simply. You had three groups in Khazaria, possibly more, but three monotheistic religions, the Christians, Muslims, and Jews. And the Jews were not very populous, but one way or another, they managed to convince the king of Khazaria to convert to Judaism and to have all of the nobles convert and to have all the people convert. Why this happened or how this happened is quite obscure, because typically we think of Judaism as a non-evangelical religion, although the story goes that the Jews were called before the king to make a defense of their religion. So perhaps you could say this was a reverse evangelism, that he was forcing them to defend their religion, and for whatever reason he felt compelled. But it's an interesting, again, an example of how a small group of people, numerically inferior, can have a huge impact on history and can convert an entire kingdom to their religion. Lastly, in this European segment, we'll look at the Cathars and the Bogomils. The Cathars were people who lived in southern France, whereas the Bogomils were people who lived in southeastern Europe, in the Balkans. And both of these groups were heretical Christian groups. they oftentimes would be accused of non-monogamy. More well documented is the fact that they were often vegetarians. They often had Gnostic beliefs, anti-materialist beliefs, the idea that the world is not good, that even reproduction, sexuality is bad, that this is then paralleled in Russia. You have many different sects in Russia which are actually much more popular. The old believers in Russia, people who would mutilate their bodies, castrate themselves. So these wild heretical sects that the Catholic Church very much wanted to wipe out actually managed to maintain themselves for centuries and centuries in these areas. And it's said that while they were persecuted and while they are said to have been wiped out, that some of them, rather than submit themselves to death and die fighting, practiced a form of crypsis where they pretended to be Catholics and with the mainstream Christianity, but actually went on to influence and found other groups like the Knights Templar. So again, small groups of people, wacky beliefs, but possibly had a much larger impact on European history than we would think. Moving on to Africa, we're going to talk about the Bantu people. The Bantus, kind of like the Indo-Europeans of Africa. They begin in the Western Africa, sort of around Nigeria. They begin in this region and they expand and they expand and they expand. And if you think about Africa, Africa is a big continent. Okay, it is a similar size to Europe, and so for the Bantu people to expand from the region of Nigeria down to the region of South Africa is similar to the Indo-Europeans expanding from Ukraine to Ireland or Ukraine to India. So this is a similar size and scope expansion. When we then go into later African history, talk about the Zulu Empire, you can think about the Zulu Empire as to the Bantu as the Romans are to the Indo-Europeans. That is, they start their own diaspora, but they're a subgroup of the Bantu. So the Zulu are interesting because as they were expanding into South Africa, they were foreigners. The native people of South Africa, the Hottentot peoples, as they're referred to by the European colonialists, and the Xhosa peoples, however you pronounce that. I'm never going to pronounce it. I think you have to click at first. I'm not going to click. But you have these people who are native to South Africa, and the Zulus come in as conquerors, as imperial conquerors. At the same time, the Dutch and the English and Europeans, Portuguese, are coming into South Africa. They're encountering the Zulu and having battles. What's interesting about the Zulu is they did not have guns at the time. They did not have weapons like these rifles. And so they were fighting with spears and they were fighting with shields. But when you actually look at their fighting tactics and their ability to defeat all these other African groups, we have to wonder that if they had not had firearms at the time, or if the Dutch had been, or the English had been deprived of firearms, if those battles would have been won in the same way. A very interesting group of people, again, started off in a small region of Africa and expanded. Next, we'll talk about the Hutu and the Tutsi of Rwanda. We've heard of the tragedy of the Rwandan genocide. And the interesting thing about that Rwandan genocide is it was two African populations, Hutus versus Tutsis. The way that the narrative is that it was all the faults of Europeans because Europeans came and they told one of the groups that they were better than the other. And therefore, these people who had been living in harmony and prosperity into the ancient primordial past, all of a sudden they started hating each other because the Europeans taught them to be racist. Well, again, looking at the Zulus, who were quite expansionary and quite competitive prior to the European arrival, I think does cast some doubt on that narrative. But the Hutus and the Tutsis were quite different, despite being in this it's a small country, the country of Rwanda, right around, I believe, Lake Victoria. The fierceness of that struggle between the two we now call a genocide. Although I think the hate and enmity on both sides was significant. I think there was a desire on the one hand of a kind of minoritarian rule. I don't think they were necessarily split 50-50. So it's an interesting thing to look into, controversial, to deprive the Africans of all agency and to say that, oh, well, they would have just been singing Kumbaya if they hadn't been taught how to hate by foreigners. There may be some truth to that, but I think in their own right, the competition between the Hutus and the Tutsis, we have to investigate as the competition between a numerically inferior and numerically superior population. Next, we'll talk about the Igbo people of Nigeria. Nigeria as a country is doing quite well in Africa today. And within Nigeria, there are Christians and there are Muslims, and there are also pre-Christian beliefs that are still perpetuated in the country. But one of the tribal groups in Nigeria that's quite prominent are the Igbo people. An interesting book to read is Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe that details the pre-Christian culture of the Igbo people, a very patriarchal society, an agricultural society, a warrior culture. And so you can get the taste and feel for these people. Moving on to the Indians of Africa. These are people from India. These are people when the British colonized Africa, they brought over workers. In the same way, if you go to the United Arab Emirates today, you're going to find a lot of foreign workers. These were foreign workers who were brought in. And ultimately, even Gandhi was spending time in Africa as an Indian living in Africa. The fate of these people, we don't hear about them too much today because they were expelled by Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe and other places. They were seen as a threatening minoritarian group, a group that was small in number but had an incredible amount of economic power within these countries. So to a large extent, they were expelled and went back to India or went to Britain. Only white people colonized Africa. Only white people engage in this kind of minoritarian rule. We can look at the Indians of Africa and see that's not simply the case, and it may go that way with the Chinese as well. Next, we'll look at the Austronesians. The Austronesians are ultimately from an area of the world closer to Indonesia in Asia. And they, with boats, somehow went across the Indian Ocean, maybe hugging the coast along the way, but they made their way all the way to the island. These are people who speak a language that is ultimately from the region of Asia around Indonesia, who took boats and went across the Indian Ocean and hugging the coast and made their way to Madagascar. And they intermix with the local population, and they have a language that is not African in origin. So this small group of people made a trek over thousands of miles, very similar to the Samoans and the Hawaiians and the Polynesians. They made this trek all the way back eastward to Africa, colonized Madagascar, gave it a very unique cultural and ethnic mix-up that it has today. The next three we'll talk about would be the Rhodesians, Afrikaners, and Germans as three examples of European colonists who went into Africa and made a big impact. What's interesting about the Germans is that I believe during the First World War, there was wartime activity between the Germans and the British, and the Germans were so small in number. Germany didn't have a lot of troops to sacrifice, but they managed to rally the people and to erect a force that was capable of defending from the British. Understand that the British, they had much bigger colonies, much bigger troops, so this was a very small contingent of Germans who had a fairly good handle of things at that time. Moving on to America, we've got the Mormons. We've got Mitt Romney. We've got him as a presidential candidate. And we have a preponderance of Mormon infiltration of the FBI, CIA, intelligence agencies. The Mormons go back to the 19th century when they tried to form their own independent theocracy in Utah, which was then attacked by the federal government, supposedly over the issue of polygamy. But really, I think the American government was not happy that there were these people trying to start a new country within their country. And so they used polygamy as an excuse. Today, Mormons claim to not practice polygamy, although some fundamentalist sects still do that. Mormons are essentially an ethno-religious group. They are evangelical, and so they have Hawaiians and Polynesians and all kinds of people in there. But there is an old Mormon stock going back to Joseph Smith, and the Mormons are very much like the Bible. The Mormons take genealogy seriously. When you read in the Bible, and such was the son of such, and it just goes on and on and on. Well, the Mormons are very into that. They're very into genealogy and ancestry and where they come from. And in fact, they're said to practice different forms of baptism for dead people, and that's part of the reason why their genealogies are so extensive, is because they're trying to baptize everybody in the world. They are an interesting group of people who have a keen sense of themselves, both on a genealogical scale as well as a religious scale, and have quite an outsized influence in terms of American politics and the intelligence agencies. Next, as I promised, we've got the Amish or Mennonites. These are a group of people from Germany who were nonconformists. That is, they were Protestants who did not fit in with Lutheranism. They did not like the innovations of the world. They didn't like technologies. They were very committed to their way of life. They were not so committed to the country of Germany, where they were persecuted. Sometimes also referred to as Anabaptists, meaning without baptism, so that they would not baptize their children at birth, but would do it as a choice later on. The Mennonites and Amish and Anabaptists spread out into South America, and Pennsylvania, and into Russia even. Prior to the Bolshevik Revolution, there were plenty of Mennonites living in Russia. So these people, while they don't have technology, they do have high birth rates, and they are still expanding as a population. Next, we've got the Jesuits in South America. Were founded to combat Protestantism. Protestantism in countries like Poland, which we don't think of as a Protestant country today, but you have to understand Poland's right next to Germany and even Scandinavia. The Swedes were fighting wars in Poland at certain times, so it was a country that was on the verge of being Protestant, and in fact had practiced religious freedom for a long time. But groups like the Jesuits were intended to launch a counter-reformation where countries which were on the fringe of becoming Protestant would be won back for Catholicism. So this is the origin of the Jesuits. They were given these new powers by the Pope and the Church, and new abilities, and had different sorts of leeway and certain, you might say, aspects of their organization that were unique, that allowed them to do things that were out of the ordinary for normal priests. So when the Jesuits went to South America, they started founding these empires, and they started founding banks, and they started founding countries, and they were in positions of governments, and they were in financial mercantile positions. So this was a group that originally you could say was part of a priest class, but then branched off into all of these other forms of societal organization. Now, in some ways, you could say that the Protestants had their own version of the Jesuits called the Freemasons. Now, the term Freemason is a little bit problematic because sometimes I think it's too broad and sometimes it's too specific, just meaning that there were a lot of groups starting from the Protestant Reformation that had heritage from before the Protestant Reformation that carried on long afterward, that in some sense might carry on to the present day. But the Freemasons generally were not Catholics. In fact, the Catholic Church had banned Freemasonry at various points, although today they've relaxed that, which to me indicates they've pretty much made up and they're on the same terms today. But, you know, the Freemasons were esoteric Protestants, whereas people like, take John Calvin or take Oliver Cromwell or the Puritans of New England, the Protestants on their surface, and popular Protestantism, you might say, was very much iconoclastic, against art, against paganism, against anything that might be non-biblical. But the Freemasons were people living in Protestant countries who themselves had many Protestant beliefs, but they were interested in art, they were interested in architecture, they were interested in esoteric learning, they were interested in apocryphal tales and apocryphal theology, meaning theology that's not in the 66 books of the Protestant Bible. So they were interested in reading all kinds of secret numerologies into the King James, and branching out with new rituals and new mysteries. And in fact, they trace back those mysteries to the time of Hiram, and even back further with the Greeks. So the Freemasons in North America, as a political entity connected with the Freemasons in England, managed to start a revolution. We know that George Washington was a Freemason. A huge number of the Continental Congress were Freemasons. So it was a quasi-religious grouping, meaning that it was open to Jews and Christians and even Muslims, although there weren't a lot in North America at that time. But it wasn't necessarily a religion itself, but it did have certain religious or priestly practices. The Freemasonic leaders did come out of a guild tradition, but with the destruction of the guild system in Europe, they did grow out into these mercantile functions. You look at the Dutch East India Company, the flag of the Dutch East India Company with its 13 stripes and the British flag. That flag is inspired in many ways by Freemasonic symbolism, because the founders of the Dutch East India Company, as both a mercantile enterprise as well as a corporate state in India, that was founded by Freemasons. So a very powerful, influential, small group of people. To bring it to the present day, we've got three groups I'd like to highlight. The Armenians in America, and their predominance when you look at Dan Blazarian, maybe, and his father, who his father was, how his father got rich. You look at the Kardashians in America, their wealth and their influence. And the reason why they're here is because of the so-called Armenian genocide, which Turkey disputes. I'm not sure what the status in the West is, how you're allowed. I believe there are certain Ocasio-Cortez is claimed to be a denier because she has some kind of deal with the Turks, and they're very active, right? When they have their Remembrance Day, it's all over Twitter, and so they have their own church, the Armenian Orthodox Church. They've got their own ethnicity. They are a very small group who came over after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and so they've left their own mark on America. You've also got Asian Americans, who are interesting in the sense that they are overrepresented in terms of their testing ability and in terms of their average wealth per capita. Asians in America, whether it's Chinese Americans or Japanese Americans or Indian Americans, they tend to have these good test scores versus average Americans, and they tend to have a higher wealth per capita. Despite that, they're not necessarily as well represented in the billionaire class of America as you might expect, although that may be changing with some of these new tech companies and tech upstart companies. Let's move on then to Britain, and we're going to look at 6 different groups here. The Romans in England. Prior to the Romans coming to England, England was Celtic. Prior to the Celts coming to England, England was pre-Celtic or proto-Celtic. But the Celts came in and they didn't wipe everybody out. We know this from genetic records. The Celts came in and they didn't kill everybody. But through a small group of people, they managed to change the entire language of the British Isles. And then the Romans came in. They didn't kill everybody, but with a small group of people, they changed the entire language of the British Isles so that all the people of England were speaking Latin. And then the Germans came in with the Anglo-Saxons, and the Vikings came in. And they then changed from Celtic to Latin to English or Anglo-Saxon. And so all the people of the British Isles are speaking English. Now, maybe I should leave Ireland out of this. Ireland did not speak Latin, or the Irish didn't speak Latin. They could read and write Latin, the Irish monks, but they didn't change to Anglo-Saxon until much later. The Irish potato famine really established English as a language there. But the Scottish and the English started speaking Anglo-Saxon. And then the Normans come in. And then the Normans influence Anglo-Saxon so that it becomes modern English with this French influence. And the Normans themselves are a Germanic group. The Northmen, the Normans of northern France, come from Scandinavia. They went to France. They learned French. They then invade with William the Conqueror into England, and they're teaching the upper class, and they're bringing the upper class, this Norman upper class, this aristocracy. They're all speaking French that influences the language of the lower class, but that's a process that takes hundreds of years, from William the Conqueror to the time of Chaucer. Huge linguistic transformation, which is part of the reason why nothing can be spelled right in English, and why English, compared to a language like German, there's no such thing as a German spelling contest, because the language makes sense. It's phonetic. But English, we have this convoluted system, not just because of the Norman influence, but also because so many words were respelled to be similar to their Latin origins. So the Normans themselves did not just invade England, but they also invaded Sicily, and you find that during the time of the Crusades, the Norman kingdom of Sicily was launching these crusades into the Middle East. So the Normans, very influential people, and when we think of the British aristocracy, these are not people who are Anglo-Saxons necessarily, but these are people who are Normans. The other two Britishy minoritarian groups I wanted to mention were the British in India, like Rudyard Kipling. A very small group of British people in India taught all the Indians English, and they had a huge impact in terms of taking in India that was divided at the time and really uniting that country today. I mean, the idea that we have a united India as one country, rather than a million different little satraps and Mughal dynasties and princes and whatever, that is really owing to the influence of the British. The last one I would mention would be Hong Kong. When we think of Bruce Lee as a Chinese martial artist, what we don't recognize is that his father and grandfather were actually descended from British who went over to Hong Kong, and they made this little city-state into a trading capital of the world. We mentioned before the Dutch East India Company, which is big. We mentioned before the Mizraim of Baghdad, who had the Sassoon family, who were also influential in Hong Kong. So there's a lot of tying together of different minoritarian groups in Hong Kong. Next, we'll move on to the Indo-Persians. So not British in India, but Indians in Britain. So we'll talk about the sassy socialists of Persia, the Mazdakites. The Mazdakites, I've done a video on before, but they were a group which has these Zoroastrian origins. The Zoroastrians themselves were a small cult of people within Indo-European Persia who had this revolutionary dualistic faith, which was in many ways monolatric. That means they worship one god, but they believed that there were two gods, one that is good, one that is evil. And they managed to change the religion of Persia. But the Mazdakites are part of this tradition that were, you could say, I almost said super Protestant, but they were sort of like the Protestant wing of the Zoroastrians. They were social reformers. They were like the Cathars and the Bogomils. They were oftentimes anti-materialists, vegetarians, accused of being non-monogamous. All of these things, socialists essentially. You find that these Mazdakites then sort of go into this Cripsis period with Islam and influence Islam through Shia Islam today. In connection with Persian religiosity, we should also mention that the Persians haven't just been, Zoroastrian and Muslim or even Christian and Jewish, but they've also been Buddhist. We don't hear about this a lot, but the Buddhists of Persia were extremely influential in being these traveling evangelists of Buddhism. Buddhism, of course, originated in India, which a long time ago spoke a very similar language to the language of Iran. And so Buddhism spread into India, and the upper class and the princes of Persia became Buddhists, and they traveled all over the world. Specifically, they went east into China, and even as far as Japan. We have the tales that we had these Persian Iranian princes going to Japan and teaching the Japanese people Buddhism, which today is hugely influential because besides Shinto, Buddhism is a huge religious practice in Japan. We owe that in part to the Buddhist Persians. Right next door to the Persians, we have the Kurds, who speak this Indo-Iranian language. And the Kurds have had this huge geopolitical importance with Kurdish independence in the Syrian civil war, but they live not just in Syria, but also in Turkey, and they live in Iran, and they speak a cousin language to the main Persian Iranian language, and they have their own history, their own mountain existence. They seem to be rather feminist compared to other people of the Middle East, quite in favor of women's rights. A lot of American anti-fascists have gone over to join the YPG, which is the socialist Turkish Workers' Party that fights for the Turkish ethno-state. It's quite convoluted and confusing, but they are a small group of people who, despite the efforts of Saddam Hussein to subdue them, and despite the efforts of the Turkish state to rename all their towns and cities to be Turkish, they have persisted. They still exist. They're still fighting for independence, backed by the United States government, although less so under Trump. An example of how a beleaguered people with its own little version of Islam can survive the colonization of larger groups. Speaking of Greater Persia, or the amalgamation of different kinds of Iranic or Persian peoples, when you look at the history of the Middle East, prior to the Ottoman Empire, you see this huge Persian influence. And prior to the rise of Islam, you see that Iran and Persia have for a very long time controlled vast empires in the Middle East as a, relative minority. They've controlled as far as Egypt and Palestine and Syria and all these regions. Turkey, we know, with Alexander the Great. Prior to him, we haven't quite gotten to him yet, but prior to that, the Greeks were threatened at Thermopylae when the Persians, and you had Darius the Great, and you had all the great Persian empires as an example of minoritarianism. Moving over to India now, we have the Sikhs. The Sikhs are not Muslims and they're not Hindus, but they have a syncretic faith that has aspects of both, and they have 5 important things. They have the turban, the dagger, the comb, and I think there's some other aspects. I think they're not allowed to shave as a 4th aspect, and the 5th is probably an article of clothing. But the Sikhs are a warrior people. They have existed between the Muslims of India and the Hindus of India, and they've decided not to go on either side and form their own little group, and they have been quite influential in the history of India, even, I believe, assassinating an Indian prime minister. Next, we have the Gurkha people, who are an amalgamation of Nepalese people and North Indian people, who actually, in terms of their looks, they don't necessarily look Indian. They look more Asian, but they are said to be a warrior people. They were employed in great numbers in the British Army to great effect and said to be fearless of death. They do have a kind of Hindu religion. They worship certain Hindu gods of war. And so as a small group of people, had a huge impact in the British Empire. Lastly, for India, we have the Brahmin, and the Brahmin are this group of people in India which established the caste system, which have the Brahmin at the top, the Kshatriya, the Vaishya, the Shudra, and then the Dalit at the bottom. But it's not actually as simple as those 5 castes. You actually have a huge number of local castes, that is, per region. You'll have different types of Brahmin and different levels, and they've made this a very detailed science. But the Brahmin are said to have been the original invaders of India, who took over from the Dravidians. The Dravidians themselves, who possibly spoke a language that came from Iran originally, and who conquered a population that was maybe more similar to the Austronesians that we talked about with Madagascar. The Brahmin put themselves at the top of this caste system. They have their Vedas, which are some of the oldest living religious documents in the world that are still in active use for a large number of people. And they are overrepresented in India's professional class and in terms of, Indian chess champions and Indians abroad who make their wealth in the West. Last but not least, I wanted to mention the Greeks. The Greeks are very much like the English in this respect. When I talked about the Celts and the Romans and the Anglo-Saxons and the Normans, well, the Greeks have had their own sorts of invasions and expansions, starting with the Dorian invasion, which is said to have been from the north of Greece. Who these Dorians were, where they came from, quite obscure. Similar to the Sea Peoples, which I suppose I should mention as a question mark. I guess that would have gone in the Middle Eastern category. The Sea Peoples who caused the Bronze Age collapse were said to be from Northern Europe. The Dorian invasion seems to have been a similar or even concurrent phenomenon in ancient Greece. These Dorian peoples came in, invaded, and changed the culture of Greece. The name Dorian is reflected in the Doric style of architecture of columns. You have the Doric and the Attic and the Ionian. But the Dorian invasion of Greece would not be the last invasion of Greece. You then had the Macedonian invasion, whereas it's contested, was Alexander the Great not a Greek himself? He was tutored by Aristotle, and he was fluent in Greek and Greek culture. When he invaded Greece, he then expanded into the east. He expanded into Egypt and Palestine and Iran and Afghanistan, and he founded Greek kingdoms there. And he instated his generals as local leaders, and they adopted themselves to the local populations. They assimilated, much like when the Normans of Scandinavia went to France, they learned French. Well, the Greeks of Alexander, when they went in and invaded a country, they learned the customs. Rather than enforcing Greek on the people, they learned their customs. But we still do see evidence of Greek coinage, Greek religion in Bactria, which today is called Afghanistan. We see there that these Greeks were adopting Buddhism, and they were still practicing elements of Greek culture. So they did leave a big impact on the Middle East. We've got a kind of minoritarian multi-layering there with the Macedonians invading Greece and Greeks invading the Middle East. In connection with this, Greeks in the East, Greeks didn't just limit themselves to Afghanistan, but they also went to China. And it's said that the Terracotta Army, which was this massively commissioned army of statues by a Chinese emperor, was actually designed and implemented by Greek sculptors in China. The last one on the list, and I know there are more. I know there's more people to talk about, and I'm sorry if I left your group out, and you'll have to leave it in the comments, and we'll have to do another 50 Minoritarians Part 2, but the last one in my list here would be the Janissaries. Predominantly the Greeks of the Ottoman Empire. Although they weren't exclusively Greek, the Greeks did form a huge part of the Ottoman soldiery and the Ottoman military, and they were very influential in Ottoman victories. And again, looping back to what I said before about the Barbary pirates, that people conceive of, the European slave trade as some kind of, racial victimary. Oh, the Europeans were enslaved by these Muslims. But we forget and we ignore, maybe too conveniently, that the Barbary pirates were Armenian and Albanian, and even Dutch were joining the Barbary pirates. And similar here with the Ottomans, when the Ottomans were invading, when the Ottomans were going up and they were at the gates of Vienna, that it was a clash of the races. Well, not so black and white as that when we look at the Janissaries who were recruited from the local European population who rose to the heights of the Ottoman Empire. And as an aside, when we look at the Ottoman rulers, and their wives were named Roxana, and they were Slavic from Ukraine, and they would continue to import these women generation after generation and distribute their seed throughout the aristocracy and create those kinds of intercultural classes of people. The Janissaries present a complex picture of the organization of the medieval Ottoman Empire and its organization, not as a genocidal regime or a monoracial regime, but a multicultural and diverse regime. And we could go on at length about the Romans and Julius Caesar. I did want to make a video on how Julius Caesar was a multiculturalist, how he was a socialist, how he was a Bernie Sanders guy, how he was a progressive, how he was a liberal. I did want to make a video on that, but I don't know if that video is quite ready. But I hope you've enjoyed this one. It's been a long time in the making. It's been a theme of the channel for far too long for me not to sit down and make the compilation. But of course, perfectionist as I am, I know I've left out a bunch, and I know I haven't done due justice to each one. So if there's people I'm leaving out, let me know. I did leave out certain groups that I didn't felt fit the political label. I'm not just talking about minorities here, guys. That would be one thing to just give you a string and list of minorities. For example, the Roma people of Europe. The Roma people are a distinct minority. They've survived persecutions. Why not include them on the list? And I could have very well. And, you know, that's a debate that can be had. It's not black or white. But I wanted to list people who I felt were, throughout history, minorities who still held power and influence beyond pure numerical superiority. To show you that history is not a series of democratic contests, that oftentimes you can have a large number of people who are controlled by a small number of people. And the mechanism of that power relation is often bound up in a religious or ethnic conception of identity. And so when we look at the future, I think that a lot of the precedents that we see in history are going to carry forward, you know, with new technologies and social media and things like that. But still, I think this is going to continue to be a reality, as opposed to the picture of the continental blocks, you know, the fourth political theory where, you know, there will be a Russian empire, and there will be an African Union, and there will be a European Union and a Chinese empire, that everything is going to be like these perfect, you know, Samuel Huntington Clash of Civilizations, cut and dry. I don't think it's that simple. I don't think that's actually the way things work. So I hope this has been enlightening. I hope this has been a good refresher for everybody else. Until next time, thanks for listening.